All right. Hello. Welcome. Tonight we are going to be discussing Silver in the Wood by Emily Tesh. This is the 2019 novella. It is the first in the Green Hollow duology. And Wikipedia describes this as fantasy romance, which we're going to talk a little bit about as well. I thought of this more as a Green Man myth retelling with like bonus queerness, but all right, you want to market it as a fantasy romance. To start with, I would love to know what you thought of this. If you read this, if you're watching on the replay or you're watching live, what did you think? Did you enjoy this? Did you find it fun? I don't know. I also want to give us a quick plot synopsis, just if you're coming to this randomly on the replay. So our protagonist, Tobias, is a large, isolated man living alone and guarding a wood. And his life really begins to change when a practical folklorist named Henry Silver becomes the new landlord of the manor and the surrounding woods. And when Silver begins investigating the forest, especially the story of a bandit named Fabian, bandit or like gang leader named Fabian Redfay Frey, messiness ensues. So that's sort of where we're at with the vibes of this story. Hey, Lydia. So Lydia in the chat has mentioned that she loves this book and has the second on the list to check out as well. It was a good little read. I am going to perhaps challenge that a little bit. The first time I read this, I loved it. Absolutely adored the like weirdness of it, and there was like a lot of mystery. I had so many questions, and I just wanted to keep reading to find out and like to have my questions answered. So I think as a first time read, this is very effective. Like it's a very maybe like an ice cream or like a candy sort of read. Like you want to like gobble it up really quick, right? I have now read this 3 times and I'm struggling with it more with every reread. So I found this one review on Goodreads, and I feel like this sort of captures the experience that I'm having now, having read it multiple times. And this person describes, left in their review, quote, "It left me equally captivated and unsatisfied. A strange combination," end quote. And so I actually ordered the sequel because I was like, will that make this unsatisfied feeling go away? Like, I almost feel like there's maybe too much going on here for such a short space. Like, we're going to talk about the queer romance too. I didn't buy the romance. Like I didn't get into it. And I read some reviews where folks were absolutely fawning over Henry and Tobias as this like to die for couple, and the like silliness of your perhaps future mother-in-law who's really annoying showing up at your cottage looking for her son who is your crush, right? Like that really spoke to a lot of readers based on the reviews, and that was not what I got from this. I actually found Silver quite abrasive and annoying. So I'm curious, how did you feel about Tobias and Silver? Like, did you find these characters equally interesting? Like, personally, what I found fascinating, especially on the initial read, was Tobias. Like, we're sort of left little breadcrumbs. It's withheld from us for quite a while. whether or not Tobias is just a weird, beardy loner who lives in a hut in the woods or something magical. Yeah, so I don't know. So Lydia's mentioned that she was a first-time reader. I also wonder if maybe it's because I read this like in succession, specifically looking for notes to like pull things apart. Oh God. Let me just shut that down. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know if the notification sound picked up. I apologize. So yeah, I find this kind of a weird experience. Like typically when I put together show notes, if it's a book that I was sort of middle of the road on, I maybe don't like the experience of the story, but I like the experience of like researching and often come to a place of like appreciating the story. Whereas I feel like this time, the more closely I paid attention, the more holes I found and the less satisfying it was as an overall experience. Like it almost felt like with each reading of the text, it was like I was secretly being held up like a wet piece of paper. And if I poked, I was like, oh, the paper is wet, and my finger just went right through it. So that being said, let's talk a little bit about the writing, because I feel like what captured my interest the first time was that the writing is quite lovely. Like, it really invites you to get swept up into this kind of wild, wacky, woodsy, gay thing. And then there's this like climax that is really weird. And it took maybe 3 readings to maybe, heavy question mark, have pulled apart what happens at the climax. So, I mean, I think that's like part of the appeal of the writing is that it is kind of open-ended and creating questions, creating that sense of curiosity in the reader. So to go back to my question about the characters, Lydia has mentioned that Tobias is more in-depth. I agree. I think Tobias is clearly the more interesting character. She mentions that she didn't find Silver very fulfilling. So not quite abrasive. I found him abrasive, and I will get to why. And yes, the history of the woods. That is one of those like big open questions that when we get to the climax of the novel and like throughout the like spoilery bits of this, like there are questions that I have about the woods, what's at the heart of the woods, that are so interesting. And maybe it's my fault for like not having like the same love and excitement for this text on a like 3rd reread. So I did want to point out that one reviewer on Goodreads described this book as, quote, quite slow. And if at first I thought that the pacing was odd, things happened too quickly, but the book is still slow, I realized that in a way it was a reflection of how the main character, who is part of the wood, experienced time himself. So I just wanted to call this out because I feel like maybe this might not be a good excuse, but it might give some explanation for what I may be struggling with a little bit. That if we're supposed to be sort of experiencing things as Tobias experiences them. Tobias is our window into this world, into this text, and he's this 400-year-old supernatural thing, former human soul that's been tied to the woods in some way, that he's not experiencing time or narrative in a particularly linear or sensical manner. That might explain things, maybe, if we're being generous. So I just wanted to highlight that as a potential way of maybe making sense of some of the things that I struggle with. Like, perhaps if Tobias is supposed to be our window into this world, and he doesn't quite know how everything works, maybe that's why when I reread it and I start to push on things, like it's like wet paper that my finger goes right through. But yeah, I thought that was a really interesting way to make sense of this, so I wanted to share that. And the one thing that I really liked about this was the idea of practical folklore. And we will talk a little bit about folklore and practical folklore, how it works here. But I feel like the introduction of it, because like part one is like weird, whimsical forest stuff. Part two is Mrs. Silver shows up and she's like, "Hi, I'm a practical folklorist, and I'm basically alternate universe Victorian era Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Like we kill ghouls and vampires and ghosties and beasties, and it both halves are interesting, but they almost feel like they belong in different stories." And maybe that's another thing that I'm sort of struggling with. And I'm curious if moving into Drowned Country, which is the sequel, if it will have a little bit more of a cohesive feel, just because we now are like fully established in like the world where practical folklorists exist and they do X, Y, and Z, right? So from this point, really, we're going to get more into spoilers. Do I think that spoilers super matter? Like, will this still be a fun read if you know how it ends? Yes, I think so, because I think the climax of this novel is so confusing. Like, I've read this 3 times, and like I'm very carefully paying attention to the climax, and I'm still not 100% sure I have understood it. So maybe like being here for this discussion, if you haven't read the book, will give you like some framework or leg up for when you finally get to reading this book and you get to the climax. So I don't know, your call. At this point, we're going to start talking spoilers. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is the woods and the trees. They are very present in this text, obviously. And I really like the idea of rootedness versus being unrooted or uprooted, and then the potential for environmental messaging, and whether or not we could maybe read that there. Is that there at all? So at the heart of this story, at the heart of this woods, there is an oak tree. And so it's that oak tree that's near Tobias's hut. It's the only thing in the woods that does not move, apart from the old shrine. And Mrs. Silver, spoilers, Mrs. Silver believes that the oak tree needs to come down, and that's the only way to get her son back. And so Tobias is bound up in this tree, and bringing it down will bring an end to him, possibly. And it takes hours to bring down this tree, and we have this description of Tobias, and I think an extra woodcutter or some sort of manservant comes along to help him do this. It's not the elderly Mrs. Silver who's doing this. And they're cutting down this tree. They're working to cut down this tree. And then while they work, the cottage moves to be in a place that when the tree falls, it will destroy Tobias's home of the last 400 years. And Tobias knows that there's nothing that he can do to stop this, that the oak will fall where he wants. And he's sort of resigned to being whatever once this happens. Like once the tree comes down, once his home's destroyed, things will be what they are. And when the tree comes down, quote, the whole wood thrummed with the expectation of something, end quote, on page 75. Like this whole space, this whole environment, ecosystem is intimately tied into this tree that's the heart of the forest that they've brought down. And I think the idea of the tree, like this tree being the heart of the forest, of this being this really looming presence throughout the story, like the oak is always there. It's one of the things that doesn't move, right? So we started looking at trees, the idea of the tree as something that has its roots in the ground and its branches reaching towards the sky. It's something that comes up in a lot of religions, a linking between the heavens and the underworld. In Norse mythology, I might butcher the pronunciation of this, Yggdrasil is a central cosmic tree. And we see this idea of these trees in religions continuing as late as the 19th century. There are the warden trees in areas of Germany and Scandinavia, considered to be guardians and bringers of luck, and offerings were made to them. And specifically, the oak tree is commonly a symbol of like strength and endurance. Many countries have them as their national tree. And I feel like it's an interesting, I guess, visual of like how maybe best to live life, being both rooted and reaching. So knowing who you are, for example, having a core foundation to yourself, a rooting, but always reaching and striving to learn more. At the start of the novel, we see that Tobias is rooted, but not reaching. He has no goals. He's sort of set to wander this woods indefinitely. And Silver is reaching in that he's this like young practical folklorist who's collecting the local folklore and wandering around doing these cool wacky things. And he found this like weird property that has some legends around it, and he's going to buy it and explore it. And like, so he's reaching, but he's unrooted, right? And I'm curious, do you think by the end of the novel, the characters have found a balance, or have they switched places? Because I feel like I've been noodling on this a while, and maybe we could noodle on this and come back to this at the end of it, but I feel like things work out better for Tobias than they do Silver. That by the end of this, Tobias perhaps is learning who he is, that these woods are like sort of part of him and his past. He has some roots there, but he's also reaching and now exploring the modern world. But I don't know about Silver. I think Silver maybe did a swap from being unrooted and like fully reaching all in the branches to being stuck like Tobias was. But we'll noodle on that. We'll think about that maybe. Okay, religions. Going back to religions. The oak in many religions, in prehistoric Indo-European religions, was worshipped and connected to thunder gods. And this tradition descended into a lot of the classical cultures. So Greek mythology, we have the oak tree sacred to Zeus. Celtic polytheism, we had the oak being like strong and firm, and the Celtic priests, the oak was sacred to them. We have Norse, obviously the oak is connected to Thor. There are like so many gods. Like when I started going through this, there are so many gods that are connected to this oak tree and god of thunder. And so I guess the question also to think about as we think about this story and what poison lies underneath this oak tree, they keep talking about it being like an old god, like older than old. Is it some sort of early, forgotten, prehistoric god that has been abandoned, neglected, festering, angry under this ancient oak? I don't know that we have an answer to that. That's one of those questions where, like, again, it took 3 readings of the text and being like, what does an oak tree symbolize? To maybe wonder if that is what is supposed to be the old thing that they keep referring to, but not by name. And so I'm wondering if there are a couple of layers here. So we have something very, very old, and then maybe something slightly less old with like whatever shrine Tobias visits to eat the berries, and then Christianity. Christianity has come in and humans have moved on to that. And I wanted to bring up another book that I was reminded of, The Bear and the Nightingale by Katherine Arden. So in this book, Christianity has come in and centered God over everything else, including the spirits of the land and the house, and the natural order of things it starts to fall apart a little bit. And we see, like, in this text, I don't think Christianity is ever named as the religion that they are practicing, but we are told that the priests, or that the woodcutters have a circle of white stones for protection that is just kind of like higgledy-piggledy enough that the priests probably won't question if they're doing anything sinful. Right? So that's the one mention that makes me think it's Christianity that's come in and replaced these beliefs, made the old ways of offering berries or foods to the spirits of the wood obsolete. Yeah. It's also, thinking about oaks, it made me think about how humanity interferes with nature. So apparently, many species of oak are actually under threat of extinction in the wild due to land use changes, livestock grazing, and unsustainable farming and harvesting. So this blew my mind. Only 1 in 10,000 acorns results in an eventual tree. And the idea of like human interference with trees and with the land and this oak tree being at the heart of this text being massively mistreated, I would say. It's a very human reaction, I would say, to be like Mrs. Silver's like, oh, thing bad, let's cut it down. This tree, for reasons, I believe that this tree is the key to getting my son back. Let's just cut it down. No other way around it. Kill this ancient thing, the thing that provides oxygen that humans breathe. We'll just kill it. It just seems like such a human reaction. It's how we handle all of our environmental inconveniences, no matter what the long-term consequences. And again, maybe because I have another book. I was reading Once We Are Wolves, or Once There Were Wolves by Charlotte McConaughey. And so here, they're looking at reintroducing wolves to Scotland because Scotland chose to hunt all of their wolves to extinction, and that had huge environmental cascade. So with the wolves gone, there's no one like moving herds of herbivores, no one controlling the population size of herbivores, which means that the herbivores, oh my gosh, it's a hard word to say, the herbivores end up eating all of these tree shoots. So like these oaks that drop only 1 acorn, well, not only 1 acorn, they drop tons of acorns, but only one of them will make it. If you then have all of these herbivores eating up all of these tree shoots, eventually the old trees die. None of their tree shoots have made it to be trees, which means that we don't have these trees pulling carbon, right? Like pulling from the air, providing oxygen for us to breathe, right? So we have this massive cascading effect when humans are just like, well, the wolves eat my sheep. My livelihood is sheep. So let's kill the wolves. Like, do you know what I mean? Like we take the most extreme approaches, and seeing that again here in Silver in the Wood, I don't know. It just, I feel like there's such potential here because our narrative way into this text is the Green Man, the protector of the woods. And instead of doing his job, he's just sort of resigned to allowing humans to kill the heart of the woods, potentially end his life, his role as protector of the woods, caretaker of the woods, whatever you want to call it. It's odd, I think, and maybe it's just because I came from a book where it had such a strong like environmental message, but it feels weird when the book is about woods and a guardian of the woods that it's so neutral towards this human impact on the land. And then there's this weird bit at the end where Bramble, one of the dryads, also seems pretty like pro Tobias being a human, like building things, using the land. It's odd. I just think it's odd. Speaking of the Green Man, so this, people seem to, I don't know if romance makes this more marketable, but people seem to think of this as a fantasy romance. I'm thinking of this more as a playing with the Green Man legends, like the Green Man figure, and perhaps a queer retelling of this than anything. So this figure is often interpreted as a symbol of rebirth, represents a cycle of new growth that occurs every spring. The Green Man figure is found in many cultures around the world. We see it in a lot of architecture as folate heads, folate masks. Actually, there are a surprising number of them on churches. If you Google folate mask, you can see some like really neat, wacky ones on church buildings, which I find super fascinating, because if the Green Man is this pagan figure, why is it all over the church? The Green Man, you can draw parallels to different deities. We have British Celtic Lud, aka Nodens, Osiris, Odin, Dionysus. Father Christmas came up as a Green Man figure. Apparently in like early depictions, Father Christmas was shown wreathed in ivy, and was suggested to be like this woodland spirit. We also have probably maybe what we're most familiar with as like bookish people, Sargon and the Green Knight. The Green Knight is associated with the Green Man. The Green Knight belongs to the pre-Christian world, which seems antagonistic to the plot of Sargon and the Green Knight, but in the end is harmonious with the Christian world. And in modern fantasy, we see the Green Man in Tom Bombadil, the Ents in Lord of the Rings. The Wind in the Willows has a depiction of a natural deity. Wheel of Time, which I don't remember, but I definitely read this book. There's a character named Sameshta, who's referred to as the Green Man, and who is a survivor of a race called the Nim, who are entrusted gardeners of the world. Also, fantastic read is Max Porter's Lanny. Dead Papa Toothwort is a Green Man figure. If you're sort of into the vibes of this book and looking for more, Lanny is a great place to go. So like sorry, this chair is so squeaky. We see this figure come up a lot in fantasy and literature. And I'm curious, how did you feel about Tobias as a Green Man? Because it seems like for a lot of the narrative, it's sort of withholding how special Tobias is. Like, initially he's sort of introduced as like the madman who lives in the woods. The local village people have lore about a wild man, a priest of the old gods, on page 11. You can identify him by his waist length, unwashed hair, and height, according to the villagers, also on page 11. So like very early on, it's presented to us by Silver that people are like, oh yeah, the man who lives in the woods, he's a witch, right? It's like pointing at like the old lady who lives at the end of the block and being like, she's a witch. That's how it felt to me. Like he didn't feel super magical, or maybe we were supposed to be questioning if he was magical. But then we witness him do clearly magical things. Like he's a protector of this wood. He senses that there's this dryad that has gone sour in his wood, and he goes looking for this. And it's interesting, again, I looked up dryads, and so they're from Greek mythology. It's a nymph or a nature spirit who lives in trees. They were originally the spirit of oak trees. Again, we come back to the oak tree, but it was later applied to all tree spirits, and they're considered integral parts of their trees. And the dryads and Greek gods punish any mortals who harmed trees without first making sacrifices to the tree nymphs. So Tobias has this tree nymph who's angry and rootless because somebody has cut her tree down without asking for her mercy or offering a sapling in exchange. So they've lost the ritual, the connection to nature, I guess, the importance of replacing what you take, right? Like, again, the idea here is sort of neutral towards humans interfering with the environment, in that it's not that you can't cut down a tree, it's that you can't cut down a tree and not replace it. So maybe we can come back to Christianity here, that there's something in this new belief system that doesn't value nature perhaps in the same way as these older religions, that results in sort of a disrespecting of the land, that somebody has uprooted this creature. I don't know. Sorry, I got really distracted there by the dryad, but we watched Tobias sort of offer her a sapling, offer her a new place to put down roots. She's not interested. And so he puts her down. And I think it's interesting that there's a ritual around putting her down. So he has this lock of, what is it? Mistletoe. It's mistletoe. So he puts the mistletoe on her chest, and then he drives his knife through the mistletoe and through her heart. Sort of that, like, all of those vampire rituals that you have to do X, Y, and Z to a vampire or it will just come back to life. Like, there's ritual sort of some sort of magic maybe in what he's doing. And then, so for doing this, again, questioning whether or not Tobias is like magical or human, like how physical is he? How supernatural is he? The woodsmen shoot Tobias in the leg, which very much affects him. He stumbles back to his cottage. The dryad bramble protects him, and he has a bullet lodged in his thigh. And he was no doctor, nor was there any that lived in his woods. Well, there it was. He lived or not. If he lived, he'd manage. And if he died, he died. And he died in the shadow of the old oak. Maybe it was his time. He'd seen nearly 400 summers come and go now. That's on page 20. So I have a lot of questions, and like we don't really have answers, because obviously he doesn't die. But are green men, as like these wood spirits, I guess they're not immortal. They're not, because you can kill them, clearly, I guess. I don't know. Also, it's been 400 years and he's never hurt himself in any sort of serious way. Do we believe that he would have died, or because he was ritually sacrificed by Fabian to be immortal and tied to this place, would his soul have left the woods? I don't know. I have so many questions about how this works. We don't really get answers. This does, however, result in Silver and Tobias getting to spend some time together, because Silver sort of saves Tobias and offers him the medical care. We also, in this, like in Tobias being removed from his cottage in the woods and going to the manor house, we get the sense, or we get to understand, I guess, how connected Tobias is to the woods. He talks about how far he'd come from the woods. He could only feel a trace of it out at the edges of the Hall's gardens on page 24. So from that, I get the sense that he's somewhat trapped in the woods or stuck in the woods, that he starts to feel being uprooted from the woods. And when Silver asks him how he's feeling, Tobias thought about it. He could not say to Silver, quote, like a thing uprooted, though he was, end quote, on page 26. So is it again, questions I can't answer. Does he feel uprooted, like emotionally? Like if you or I left our home, or like pulled from our home, pulled from our routine, we feel uprooted from the order of our lives? Or is it like a physical, magical withdrawal, like his soul is tied to the oak tree, you know? Hi, Jess. So Jess in the comments has mentioned that they got the impression that there always had to be a protector of the woods, which makes them wonder who would be in charge of it if he had actually died. Yes, right? Would it be Fabian? Is Fabian technically supposed to be the woods protector too? And he's just not very responsible? I don't know. But it does seem like something must occupy this sacred space. Otherwise, I feel like it would go to shit really quickly. Silver tells us also about the wild man, or the green man. And he talks about how in this country, in this area of the country, this figure comes up over and over again. And he says it's obviously the modern interpretation of one of these so-called old gods, a spirit or woodland demigod. And then he goes on to say, I think the myth is separate from, although similar to, the myths of the fairy king, because regardless of the wild man's particular interpretation, whether aggressive or generous, a savage enemy of civilization or its protector, he never has a court and is always fundamentally alone. A primitive figure, not from a different civilization, but from before civilization existed at all. Whereas the fairy king, and then he trails off. That's on page 31. So two things here. That the wild man, maybe three things to go to, that there had to be a protector of the woods, that the wild man could be aggressive or generous, savage or protective. Maybe Fabian would technically be a wild man, a green man, but he would be the aggressive enemy of civilization variety. And the idea that from before civilization existed at all, that somehow whatever this thing is, whatever the green man is, pre-civilization makes me think definitely not human, and Tobias seems to be more human than wild. I don't know. So is Tobias more filling the green man role than actually a green man by this definition? I don't know. Also, this is all just like local lore too. The third thing I guess that I wanted to point out is that like we can probably safely rule out fairy king, because the text cuts off the explanation of what this is. It's not important, because Tobias isn't a fairy king, like ... He's clearly the wild man, or a sort of green man, wild man figure. And also then Tobias confirms for us, well, fairy kings are nonsense, which I thought was funny. So yeah, I feel like I want to make sense of it, and I feel like I can't, and I'm not supposed to. This is maybe one of those places where, like, I just shouldn't push too hard, and we just accept Tobias as a green man figure. Don't ask questions. So Silver goes on to talk about how Green Hollow was an important site, that the old gods mattered here. And he talks about how the landscape itself bears witness. And so he's tracing the forest over time via maps. So he's looking at 18th century, 16th century, and then he sort of makes a guesstimate of what the 12th century would look like. And Tobias looks at these maps and he's like, yeah, that looks right. I know the shape of my woods. And then Silver shows Tobias his assumptions about how large this would have been at least 3,000 years ago. And he talks about how the modern Green Hollow is only a remnant of a sacred space that was much greater. And so is the fact that this is a space, it's all that remains of a very sacred, very holy space. So is that why the thing at the heart of the woods, the thing under the oak tree, whatever old being is there, is so poisonous? It's that they once mattered. The wood was once treated as sacred. They were once treated as sacred. And now nobody gives a shit. The wood just keeps getting smaller and smaller as humans forget. They forget to pay respects. They forget to plant where they cut. And they've just cut this thing smaller and smaller and smaller until all that's left is this, like, angry, angry little being. And I mean, we really see a loss of beliefs throughout this book, right? Like, Tobias checks the old shrine. It was looking pretty ragged since they built the village church, but someone had left a handful of blackberries. And then that was in the autumn on page 15 where the book starts. And then like 20-ish pages later, around the 40-page mark, Tobias comments that there haven't been any new offerings since autumn. He really can't hope for more than a couple of offerings a year. And that, I guess, as something is being lost, something is being forgotten, but the humans aren't seeing that, right? On the same hand, we also get, or I guess not on the same hand, on the other hand, we also get some comments on the dangers of superstition, of being superstitious. It's that the woodsmen saw this wacky guy in the woods, and they were like, oh shit, the wild man, and they shot him. And then Silver's like, you know, you shot my groundskeeper. And he's like bleeding and we had to give him medicine. And they're like, oh, I'm sorry. We thought you were not human. That there's a danger in being superstitious. So at the same time that we have this, like, commentary on what is being lost, we have this, well, don't believe these silly superstitions because people get hurt when we treat old women on the edge of the woods like witches, and we treat lonely guys in the woods like wild men. So I don't know. I'm finding some conflicting messages, maybe. I don't know. This is one of those things. The more I read it, the more I'm like, does this even have a message? So to move to a positive note, because I've been poking some holes. I love the idea of the practical folklorist. So in part 2, Mrs. Silver comes in, Henry Silver's mom, and she is a practical folklorist. And Silver he identifies as a folklorist. He doesn't put that practical bit on the front. And he talks about how his passion is preserving heritage because it's being lost. That's the cost of progress. And he really wants to preserve what he can. And obviously this parallels what a lot of guardians, I guess, of folklore were trying to do. Like if you think about what the Brothers Grimm were trying to do, they began this nationalistic project of collecting German folk and fairy stories in the early 1800s because they were seeing the influence of other cultures and they wanted to preserve something. All of these tales were oral tales, and we know that oral tales shift over time with each telling, with each teller and what they've been exposed to, right? And so there was this effort, not just with Brothers Grimm, but with anybody recording folk and fairy stories to like preserve something like uniquely ours, uniquely us, before it gets polluted by other oral stories. It's kind of bullshit because, you know, these all influence each other. That's the nature of storytelling. But that Silver is sort of participating in this line of work I find interesting. And it makes me this feels like it wants to be out of time and place. Like I don't think we get a set date, but it makes me feel like this is like an alternate Victorian era, that we're looking at an alternate 1800s England in which vampires are real, wild men are real, ghosts in the forest are real. And also there's a group of practical folklorists who are hunting them down. And we learn that Green Hollow is a source of professional curiosity. So that makes me feel like there's a society of practical folklorists out there that keep an eye on places that are like haunted or rumored to have a wild man or rumored to have a fairy king. And Mrs. Silver says that like, oh yeah, all of the it was a professional curiosity, but it was being managed quite adeptly. It was hardly a priority for investigation. So she's like, yeah, we all knew about it, but like you were taking care of the mad dryads that wanted to kill woodsmen. So like we didn't bother. Like you were last on our list to deal with. And I guess he was also keeping Fabian, the Summer King, the Lord of Summer, I should say, from maybe stealing too many young boys. So like it wasn't a huge concern. I find the whole idea of practical folklorist very fun. And I'm really hoping that we get more of what that profession looks like in the sequel. I will definitely follow up on this book with like a review and a wrap up to let you know how this practical folklore stuff goes, because that is something that even on the reread I get excited about. I get excited about this profession, this like part scholar, part slayer profession. Less fun. This is why I don't like Silver. We're going to talk about why I don't like Silver. Landlord. That's my word. So quite early on in the book, Silver just shows up at Tobias's hut and he's like, I heard a story about how they chased off a wild man with a pistol and I came to see if, oh my God, right? And he's like, you're my tenant, I'll pay for the doctor. So like he's very much like bursting into somebody's house because he's the landlord. This is my property. And then when he shows up, he says, "Oh, it seems like the previous landowners, the Raffellas, just forgot about this place. I'm so terribly sorry, but in order to explain your presence to the doctor, I'm afraid I've had to raise your rent. You pay in service now. I'm not going to ask you any questions along the lines of, what are you doing in my wood? And so on. What? Oh, my wood. Yes, I know. I've only been here a few months." And Tobias goes, "Well, it's yours in the law all the same." That attitude just made it so hard to like Silver. This idea. Anyways, I'll get to it. It made me want a breakdown of the words that go into landlord and the etymology of landlord. It's so we'll start with landlord itself. So early 15th century, we have owner of a tenement who rents land or property to a tenant. And then, so I went to like the OED, and so we get from like land plus lord. So then I started looking at land, Old English, land, ground or soil, also a definite portion of the earth's surface, home region of a person or people, territory marked by political boundaries. So the etymological evidence suggests that the original Germanic sense was a definite portion of the earth's surface owned by an individual or home of a nation. The meaning was early extended to solid surface of earth. Original senses of land in English now tend to go with country, like to take lay of the land. So I'm getting hung up on the idea of a portion of Earth's surface that is owned and how ludicrous that idea is. And then we get into lord. So we have mid 13th century. I'm not sure if that V is a W sound, so lard, Laverd, from the Old English Laford, Laford, which is master of household, ruler, or feudal lord, superior, husband. Also God. And so packed into the modern monosyllabic form, landlord, as the owner of land, houses, etc., is like the idea of being a god, right? A superior, a ruler, a master over a specific bit of earth that can be owned. And I just feel like to dwell briefly on the absurdity of this, that and maybe that speaks to exactly how we get to our current climate crisis. The idea that we think of ourselves as masters over the land, owners of this bit of dirt, owner of the resources on that dirt, that relationship that we have with land is quite toxic. And we have Silver coming into this ancient space of the Green Hollow. He asserts himself as the landlord, the new owner of the manor home. And the idea, I guess, of Silver as the landlord versus Tobias as the green man, the caretaker of the woods, I think is interesting. Again, I don't know that the book gives us any specific messaging. It seems to remain quite neutral. But Tobias is our sort of gateway into the book. He's our narrative entry point. And that he models caretaking versus rulership, I think, is maybe something important to note. And that we can, because of where this is sort of positioned in its alternate universe, Victorian era, we're sort of pre-world as we know it now, pre like mass-produced McMansion houses, that like urban sprawl that just eat up land and result in more pollution and destruction and anyways, right? Like the idea that something has been deeply lost in the loss of these beliefs that are more connected to the land, that view the land as more alive, right? Like here we have these pagan beliefs with the green man, the idea that you cut a tree down, you replace it as the caretaker of the land, opposed to a lord of the land that cuts the tree down and, I don't know, builds a factory on it. I don't think the book is specifically feeding us that, but because of Once There Were Wolves, my brain is in that place. Okay, alternating that sort of belief thought, wait, I saw a comment. So Jess mentions, I think this is going back to, oh my gosh, this is going back quite a bit. So Jess mentions that for wood has gotten smaller and smaller due to people encroaching, and to add insult to injury, Silver comes on the scene saying he's taken whatever is left. Yes, that it makes him very unappealing to me. It's his attitude of being like, this is mine, I am the landlord, that I find difficult. And I find it not just difficult in like the modern sense of the world. Like I think everybody's had a shitty landlord at some point in their life that's like, I don't know, mine ripped the eaves troughs off of our houses and then like chuckled when my bedroom flooded because he didn't put the rain gutters back up, so all the water just went straight into the house instead of away from the house, and he chuckled. I didn't find it very funny that my bedroom flooded. Like, those kind of landlords, I think we've probably all had a landlord, and like they have a terrible reputation. So like in the modern sense of the word, it's a yucky word for Silver to be like, I am the landlord, but then also breaking it down, like Lord, God, ruler of the land, just feels gross too. Okay, going to something fun, queer romance. So part of the Wikipedia summary for this is that Tobias is shot by a villager as he fights off a creature, and he recuperates at Green Hollow Hall. Finch and Silver forge a Finch? Tobias and Silver, I don't know why I wrote Finch. Tobias and Silver form a romantic connection. And everywhere I look, this keeps coming up as like fantasy romance. What do you think of that? If I told you, oh, here's this great fantasy romance, like what is your expectation as a reader coming into this? No wrong answers. Because like my expectation of a fantasy romance is like A Marvelous Light by Freya Marsk, where, yes, there's magic, there's like a quest, alternative London where magic exists, but there's also like smooching. There's actually really graphic sex, not just smooching. I'm curious if folks feel a little bit misled by this, because I went through and I tried to pull like, where is the romance? What are people shipping? And so we have a few instances of flirting. So Silver flirts fairly early on about, oh, the bed's big enough to share, surely. And he gives Tobias a smile on page 12. And Tobias is like, oh, no, like I'll sleep on the floor. It's fine. Besides, we won't fit in the bed together. And then later, sometime after midnight, sitting in the near dark, thinking about nothing very much, Tobias suddenly snorted with laughter. Silver had been inviting him, not just to share a bed that definitely couldn't fit the two of them. How long had it been if Tobias couldn't even recognize a handsome lad suggesting a bit of mutual entertainment anymore? On page 13 and 14. Does that make it romance? I'm not trying to be an asshat. I'm genuinely asking. And then later, the way he had said it and the look he gave Tobias with it was flirting. Flirting! Exclamation point. At least Tobias recognized it this time. Funny thing to be flirted with by a pretty young fellow who wore an expensive coat. Made Tobias feel young again, and at the same time, very, very old. And that's on page 30. So, in both instances, it almost feels more like Silver is this like young, handsome fella who's like, hey, putting it out here, we could fuck. And Tobias is like, I'm too old for this shit. I didn't even realize you were flirting with me, sir. But somewhere in like the passing of seasons and this like wibbly wobbly space of time, Tobias catches feelings enough to cut down the tree that his life is potentially attached to save Silver, and then comes back looking for Silver, and then they kiss. So somewhere off screen, we have two little instances of flirting, and somewhere off screen, somewhere off page, Tobias develops really deep feelings, I guess, but we don't get to see it. Does that make it a romance? Like, I just wonder about the expectations set here, especially because this seems to keep getting held up as, and I think I did this too, in like, at the end of every video that I've made recently where I'm talking about this book, it's like, oh, like queerness, yay. And yes, they are two queer men. One flirts with the other, and then the one sacrifices his life for the other, and then they kiss. But when you say queer romance or fantasy romance, that for me packs in different baggage. The idea of fantasy, like escapist fantasy, wish fulfillment more so, this like over the top relationship. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think we've experienced a romance in some way, a love story in some way. Like, I guess what I'm missing is that interpersonal conflict. We see one-sided flirting, we see big life sacrifices, but we don't really see the interpersonal conflict or the relationship that would indicate that there's a relationship here other than like landlord and tenant. So I'm not sure if this is queer rep in a folk story retelling. Check, I will give it that. But is it a good representation of a queer romance in a fantasy story? I don't know. Do they have a happy ending at the end of this? Silver is rooted to the forest. He chose the forest. Tobias is now off traveling as a practical folklorist. Do they get a happily ever after if presumably Tobias is now going to live out a mortal life and die, and Silver is now an immortal being tied to the woods? Is that a happy ending? And if there is no happy ending, is that a romance? Isn't the requirement of a romance story that you get a happily ever after? And again, this is a duology. There's a second book that could answer a lot of these questions. I just don't know. I don't know how I feel about this, but a lot of folks like loved this. So I don't know. I want to talk about Fabian because I feel like Fabian and Tobias's relationship is the more interesting queer relationship. Fabian seems to genuinely want Tobias to the point that he murdered him to make him immortal and to keep him connected to the woods, because Fabian wanted to be immortal and like sold his soul to whatever old god lives in the woods to be the Lord of Summer. And Tobias actually concludes that Fabian must have loved him after all in his own way. That was the worst of it. The thing that woke now every year was always glad to see him. That's on page 52. So I would love to see, and I know it's probably a toxic relationship, like if you're murdering your summer fling so that you can have eternity with them, it's not a healthy relationship. But I find that relationship that we sort of get on the edges of the novel, on like the periphery, much more interesting than Silver and Tobias, at least with what we get on page. Okay, we are approaching the hour-and-a-half mark, so I'm going to skip over women. There really aren't women in this text. They're not very interesting. Let's talk about the climax. What has been buried? What has been buried? Sorry, buried. I say that weird. So I challenged myself to try and make a connection to our previous book club read, which is Follow Me to Ground by Sue Rainsford. In Follow Me to Ground, we talked a lot about repression and the impacts of repressing things on a person, or in this case, a thing, an entity. So repression is unwanted impulses or thoughts being unconsciously pushed out of awareness. And it's, for Freud, as problematic as he is, it's a sort of a defense mechanism to try and minimize feelings of guilt and anxiety. And while this might initially be calming, this can lead to greater anxiety down the road. So what has been repressed in Green Hollow? And I keep coming back to this. I want to say it is some old thunder god that we have no name for. The name has literally not been mentioned in the text. that has been forgotten, right? So if we look at the climax of the novel, they've cut the tree down. The tree's not dead. I mean, if we know things about trees, right? Like if you cut a tree, oftentimes it will shoot up from the stump, like it's still living. So Tobias then tries to coax the stump out of the ground, and there's like a smell or something. I was a terrible English student and didn't give myself a page number here, but it's described as not rot, which is important because decomposition is natural. It's part of the life cycle. It's part of all ecosystems. So whatever foulness here is not rot. That's pretty significant. And Tobias goes on to describe this as a foulness that refused to surrender to cleansing decay. Year on year it endured, throwing off poison in all directions, waiting in the dark, coiling itself into the fabric of the wood. So I want to say it's something not natural. And so when Tobias pulls out this stump, there's a big hole, and in the big hole, there are a bunch of bones, and there's many bodies, hundreds of bodies. It's like a graveyard underneath this oak that has been buried deeper and deeper every year, and the dead feed the woods as the wood feed upon it, according to the text on page 79. I'm not sure what to do with that image of, is it like the decomposing bodies nourish the woods? I don't know. Buried deeper and deeper every year, feeding on the wood. Whatever is in there is feeding on the wood, and the wood is feeding upon whatever being is down there. I don't know. This is what I mean when I've read this book and I've read this climax and I'm trying to figure out exactly what I'm supposed to get from this. We go on to describe, at the heart of the pit there was a stone. Tobias could feel the cold age of it, older than the shrine, older than the barrows on the hills. And Miss Silver, who's our practical folklorist, our new source of knowledge, identifies it as an altar for the old gods. So we're told that it's older than the shrine that Tobias goes to. So it is a deeply old, beginning of time, beginning of whatever sort of altar. So again, I come back to what has been neglected. It almost feels a little too big for a text of this size. That there is something so old that has festered. I don't know. I don't know that they deal with this in a satisfying way. We see two figures laying on the ancient stone. One is papery gray skin stretched over old bones with a dent in its temple, with hair coiled in faintly reddish braids. I assume this is Fabian. And wrapped in its arms is Henry Silver. So we have two figures under the earth on this old altar. Is what has been repressed queerness? Are we supposed to, because Fabian's soul, this summer lord for 400 years, has been luring queer youth into the heart of the woods and playing with them, and then they die. That's what he does every summer. So can this queerness not be out in the openness of summer? Are we looking at repressed queerness, and that's some of the toxicness that's at the heart of this woods that's not rot but won't decay? At the same time, We have a skeleton with a skull smashed in. And there's like ritual sacrifice. Is that what we're supposed to be getting? Repressed murders are happening in the woods, repressed evils. Is it something big and dark? Is it not an angry god that has withered? Is it something like evil, darkness that has been repressed? We get a quotation about, quote, what Fabian joined himself to, what Fabian found, joined himself to in Green Hollowood is something old, even older than the trees, something that should have been dead long ago, on page 52. Something that should have been dead long ago. So on the one hand, we have Silver looking to preserve old religions before they are lost, but not this one. This one should have been dead long ago. There's something so foul about whatever this is that it's good, it's forgotten, it's good, it's buried, kind of. I don't know, like when I start to ask these questions, I become less and less sure about what I'm supposed to take away from this. Moving on. So Henry Silver starts talking, and Tobias stabs him in the eyes because he knows that it's Fabian and not Silver. And Fabian planned on seducing Tobias with Silver's body. Fabian proclaims his love for Tobias. Toby, I always loved you. We'll bring the wood right up to the house again. We'll swallow it whole. We'll sleep in feather beds. You can chase off every monster but me. What do you say, Toby? One, that idea of the woods reclaiming cleared land, is that what this being wants to do? It wants to expand its borders again, make its space sacred again. And then Tobias says, you're a dead man, Faye, and even when you were alive, you were wicked right through. And then we sort of realize that whatever Lord of Summer is in Fabian, quote, was here before Fabian Raffaella's grandfather built my house, end quote. So the real deep, dark, lost thing is wearing Fabian's soul or personality, and Fabian is wearing Silver's personality. I this is why I keep reading this part, and I'm like, what the fuck is happening here? Because Fabian made a deal with something. He was researching in his library, seeking riches and beauty and immortality on page 93. So Fabian went looking for this creature in the woods, this Lord of Summer, I guess, and then became the Lord of Summer, or became the puppet of the Lord of Summer. Yes, a lot of possessing people, bodies, the woods. It's a lot of taking ownership of things that maybe shouldn't be taken ownership of, like things that should have agency getting taken over. Okay, so then the real solution here, and my question reading of the ending, is nature takes care of itself. So Fabian's sort of giving his evil villain speech, and the dryads gang up on him. All of the dryads of the forest spirits, they attack him with vines. They plant themselves around the stone altar. Their roots went plunging down into the earth like long spears plunging into flesh. The bones of men and horses that carpeted the hollow crackled and scattered as the new trees grew and grew. In a matter of moments, the stone altar broke. The papery corpse that Fabian had shed like a snakeskin fell to the earth. The ghoulish thing that was Fabian's mind and Silver's body, and the soul of something that Tobias could tell was older by far than both, near as old as the wood, a parasite that had bored in deep long ago. So now we have this thing described as a parasite. So not a god of the woods, but a parasite in this ancient sacred place. So because the gods are no longer worshipped, was a parasite allowed to sneak in? Anyways, the Dryads get involved. The Dryads force the bones under the ground. They split them smaller and smaller. The ghosts of all the murdered youth who'd lain on the altar dissipated before they reached the bottom of the pit. Fabian screams when the altar cracks. All these things are just getting pushed down and down by the Dryads into the earth, into compost. So if repression is bad, we're just pushing these things down further. Like we lifted the rock, we went, oh, that's gross, and we pushed them further into the hole. I don't know, again, what to do with this. In this, Fabian's still sort of kicking around. He's shot by Silver's mother, and then he turns to dust, and Silver's body turns to dust because he was in it. So Mrs. Silver, she initiated all of this mess to get her son's body back, to get her son back, not just his body, but her son. And then she kills him and he turns to dust, and then they have nothing. Then I guess everything is over. The altar's broken, the bones are buried. Fabian's been shot in the head and dusted. Silver's body is gone. Tobias goes back to the manor house and he sobs like a child. And then we get like the ending, the sort of like dissenting action. Tobias gets involved in slaying demons, gets to see how the world has moved on since he became stuck in the woods 400 years ago. Eventually he does come back to the woods, and he looks for his clearing where his cottage was, and he looks for Bramble and like his old life, and he doesn't see anything. He doesn't belong here anymore. And I feel a really deep sadness for Tobias, who has lost everything at this point. And then Pearl, his cat, who I haven't mentioned, but he had a cat. Pearl shows up, and she brings him to Silver, and Silver's like, yep, I've been here. I'm the new Green Man, Lord of Summer, or whatever. We're now one and the same, ? And Silver identifies himself as more or less of what Tobias was. And he's struggling to stay human because he just loses track of time. And Silver tells Tobias that the wood missed him. Tobias says, I don't belong here now. They kiss, that kiss that I talked about. Again, making me wonder, like, is this a romance? If Silver's like, I missed you, we missed you. And Tobias goes, I don't belong here. And then they kiss. Is that a romance? Is that a happy ending? Anyways, Tobias tells Silver to walk in time to think of the map. that wherever this primeval forest used to be, the land sort of remembers, like the wood remembers once being there. Like there's shadow of the trees still on the land. And the green man can walk the woods where the wood remembered it used to be, which again, this is one of those places where when you read it enough times and you take notes like this, you're like, but wait a minute, why did Tobias never leave? Why did Tobias feel so uncomfortable in the manor hall if the woods once was on the land of the manor hall and the land should remember that? Like that, it sounds like the green man is not stuck in the woods if the land used to be woods. And Tobias is giving this to Silver like it's practical advice that he didn't personally take. So I don't know if like it's a hint like, oh, like wherever the woods was, like we can be together. You don't have to stay isolated in the woods. So I don't know what to do with that. I do really like the conclusion for Tobias as a character. So he and Tobias and Bramble are talking. Bramble still, I guess, talks to people when she wants to. And she says that Silver's going to be okay in this role because he planted himself here. He chose to be rooted here. So going back to the idea of roots and reaching, Silver has chose to be rooted. And Bramble tells Tobias that he was never planted, he was stuck. You loved us and we loved you, but you never chose the wood. He did, on page 103. So Tobias has, I guess, this opportunity to really reach. He doesn't belong in the woods. He doesn't, because he didn't choose the woods. He was forced to stay there. And then she tells him to go do people things, go and grow, which is a hopeful note for him that he has this like background, he has this life experience. I guess he's sort of figuring out who he is as a person. I think I said earlier that I felt like Tobias ended up balanced, rooted, and reaching. I'm kind of thinking, rereading these words, that they have flipped, that Tobias has only known the wood for 400 years, and he doesn't fit there anymore, and he feels uprooted. So I wonder if they have switched roles, that Tobias, perhaps in book 2, is going to go on this like reaching journey to develop some roots, to put down some roots at the end, and maybe if both of them will end up a little bit more tree-like in being rooted and reaching. I do think it's a hopeful ending for at least Tobias, that he gets to, you know, grow. That's that's the big ending. It's a hopeful note for Tobias. Silver, I think, is gonna regret his choices and struggle personally. I think Silver's gonna maybe realize really quickly what he's chosen. So, books that you may like. I've mentioned quite a few throughout this, and I thought I would just put this together because in putting these notes together, I really didn't have like a big takeaway, but I had a lot of other books that reminded me of this, that I feel like depending on what you find interesting about Silver in the Woods, you might like some of these other books. So I think the obvious one, Uprooted by Naomi Novik. So we have Evil this is a fantasy novel. We have evil woods that are sort of, I guess this would be the wild men version that's like aggressive and anti-civilization. It's encroaching back on the land all of the time. And the main character, Agnieszka, and the wizard in the tower, the dragon, are trying to work to protect civilization and preserve land. This might be an interesting read. Lanny by Max Porter, if you like the Green Man figure specifically. This is a weird little book. It's almost poetic. It's about a child that ends up going missing in the woods, and it's interesting. It's a very interesting poetic read. I'm not sure if this will show up on camera, but like you have a lot of playing with the words on the text as Papa Toothwort sort of has the people's voices come through his brain or whatever he exists as a green man. This is good vibes. Like if you like the sort of woodsy vibes, that's kind of creepy. I don't know if I would describe this as creepy. Atmospheric, maybe. If you like the atmosphere of this, you might like the vibes of Lanny. Bear and the Nightingale, the Winter Night trilogy by Katherine Arden, is again sort of looking at Christianity coming in and replacing old religions. And we're looking at a little girl at the start of this book who ends up befriending the Lord of Winter. So instead of a summer king, summer lord, a lord of summer, we have a winter lord. Yes. Kind of like this, but snowier. And then just like for another look at like playing with folk and fairy stories, more stories around the wolves, like Big Bad Wolves, the woods, how humans have impact. That is not a sentence. How humans have impacted the environment, and how sort of folklore dialogues with that once we were wolves. So those are my recommendations. That is how I'm wrapping this up. I guess obviously the sequel. We can mention the sequel if you're interested. A little bit of housekeeping before we go. The September book club book is a patron exclusive. We're reading Cujo with the Red Rum Book Club. This is the next book in publication order for our Stephen King reading project, and we're meeting for this at the end of September. The next small book club book, so one that will be free to everyone on YouTube, is voted on by the voting patrons, and the book that got the most votes, we had two sort of spooky choices, but like for different reasons. We have the Midwich Cuckoos by John Windham. So this is about a sleepy English village, and a mysterious silver object appears, and all of the inhabitants fall unconscious, and then a day later the object is gone, and everybody wakes up unharmed, except that all of the women in the village are pregnant. I've never read this book before, but not your traditional like October read, but something a little bit spooky, something a little bit unsettling. So this we will be meeting actually at the beginning of November. We're looking at Wednesday, November 2nd at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So I'm excited. We're taking a step away from like the woods and fantasy literature, and we're moving into science fiction, which I'm excited about. So that's that. That is all of the thoughts on Silver in the Wood and all of the housekeeping that I have to do. I just want to thank everybody for watching. If you are here in the chat, thank you for chatting and participating. Yeah, I hope that you're all doing well, that you're staying safe, and I will see you soon with more bookish content. Bye.